Oh, so Edgar Allan Poe. You've heard of him, right? One of the most widely known American writers in history. He did a lot of different things with his writing during his short 40-year life, and Misk has been pointing out some of it to me, which is really cool. In fact, I think we're incorporating one of Misk's suggestions today. And he left an impression on generations of readers to explore the dark side of mankind through his work. Poe, that is, not Misk. Maybe Misk, I don't know. But he is most known for his stories of mystery and the macabre. Edgar Allan Poe's life was almost as troubled as some of his writings. Did you get it? Oh, you got it. Good. Hi, Kea. Welcome. We are on voice and stream, which I guess you know if you can hear me. Death and failure surrounded the man, and he fought alcohol and drug abuse for most of his life. But you got to ask, could it be that the best art comes from the most troubled souls? Edgar Allan Poe certainly supports that notion. And so on to Poe. We'll start us off with a poem. This first one is called To One in Paradise. And this poem describes one speaker's, we're talking about Poe, remember? One speaker's deep depression and now dull prospects of the loss of his dearest friend and lover. The poem begins with the speaker describing the love that he once had with this person. She was everything to him and the only source of light in his life. Poe once was reported to say the most beautiful thing in the world is the early death of a beautiful young woman. I don't know about that, but that was also... Try that again. Kayaker, hello. Mystery and imagination. Thanks for the new grog machine. I didn't install it yet. Thou wast that all to me, love, for which my soul did pine, a green isle in the sea, my love, a fountain and a shrine, all wreathed with fairy fruits and flowers, and all the flowers were mine. Ah, dream too bright to last, ah, starry hope that didn't arise, but to be overcast. A voice from out the future cries on, and o'er the past dim gulf my spirit hovering lies, mute, motionless, aghast. For alas, alas, with me the light of life is o'er, no more, no more, no more. Such language holds the solemn sea to the sands upon the shore. Shall bloom the thunder-blasted tree or the stricken eagle soar? And all my days are trances, all my nights are dreams, and where thy grey eye glances, where thy footstep gleams, in what ethereal dances, by what eternal streams. And that leads us pretty well into this morning's first Poe story, Berenice. A story you can really sink your teeth into, I think. Berenice is the grandmother of the Poe grotesquerie. The tropes of hypersensitivity, wasting women, psychosis, blotted genius, premature burial, monomaniac fixations, and gruesome psychological poignant violence all trace back to this story, Berenice. It formulates Poe's dark romantic vision by developing themes and motifs of psychological terror, obsession, and decay. Berenice is a meditation on the struggle between the antisocial introspection of the intellect and the gregarious sensuality of the body. The narrator here is a gloomy man with a gloomy life, living in a gloomy mansion with his vivacious cousin, Berenice. Berenice is the only bright spot in his life, and he views her with spiritual awe and admiration. Now, Berenice begins harmlessly enough, but those familiar with Poe will immediately sense the imminent sense of doom, because Aegeus, our narrator, has a problem. Aegeus has a monomaniacal fetish for teeth, and Berenice's teeth are impossibly perfect. Their whiteness and symmetry defy mortal standards. By the way, this is one of the few stories of Poe in which the narrator actually has a name. And yes, of course, we have, which I didn't mention, for those that may have just showed up, we have an intergrid link going on voice chat. So if you see people talking in local chat and they're not sitting around you, well, two possibilities. One, they're from the other side. This is a Poe story after all. Or they're from the other side. They're over on OpenSim. And we got an Eater Grid chat link going on, courtesy of Kayaker Magic. Dissipante mehi sodales, se sepulcrum amicae visiteram curas mias alaqualam for levatas. Or in English, my companions told me I might find some little alleviation of my misery in visiting the grave of my beloved. Misery is manifold. The wretchedness of earth is multiform. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, its hues are as various as the hues of that arch, as distinct, too, yet as intimately blended. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, how is it that from beauty I have derived a type of unloveliness, from the covenant of peace a simile of sorrow? But as in the ethics, evil is a consequence of good, so in fact out of joy is sorrow born. Either the memory of past bliss is the anguish of today, or the agonies of which are have their origin in the ecstasies of which might have been. As my baptismal name is Aegeus, that of my family I will not mention. Yet there are no towers in the land more time-honored than my gloomy grey hereditary mole halls. Our line has been called a race of visionaries, and in many striking particulars in the character of the family mansion, in the frescoes of the chief saloon, in the tapestries of the dormitories, in the chiseling of some buttresses in the armor, but more especially in the gallery of antique paintings, in the fashion of the library chamber, and lastly in the very peculiar nature of the library's contents. Yes, there is more than sufficient evidence to warrant that belief. The recollections of my earliest years are connected with that chamber, and with its volumes, and of which latter I will say no more. Here died my mother, herein was I born, but it is me a kind idleness to say that I had not lived before, that the soul has no previous existence. You deny it? Let us not argue that matter. Convinced myself, I seek not to convince you. There is, however, a remembrance of aerial forms, of spiritual and meaning eyes, of sounds, musical yet sadder, a remembrance which will not be excluded, a memory like a shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow, too, and the impossibility of my getting rid of it while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. In that chamber was I born, thus awaking from the long night of what seemed or what was not non-entity, at once into the very regions of fairyland, into a palace of imagination, into the wild dominions of monastic thought and erudition. It is not singular that I gazed around me with a startled and ardent eye, that I loitered away my boyhood in books and dissipated my youth in reverie, but it is singular that as the years rolled away and the noon of manhood found me still in the mansion of my fathers, it is wonderful what stagnation there fell upon the springs of my life. Wonderful how total an inversion took place in the character of my commonest thought. The realities of the world affected me as visions, and as visions only, while the wild ideas of the land of dreams became in turn not the material of my everyday existence, but in very deed that existence utterly and solely in itself. Welcome, Asnana. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls. Yet differently we grew, I, ill of health and buried in gloom, with Berenice, agile, graceful, overflowing with energy, hers the ramble on the hillside, mine the studies of the cloister, I living within my own heart and addicted body and soul to the most intense and painful meditations. Berenice, roaming carelessly through life with no thought of the shadows in her path or the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. Berenice, I call upon her name, Berenice, and from the grey ruins of a memory, a thousand tumultuous recollections are startled at the sound. Vividly is her image before me now, as in the early days of her light-heartedness and joy. O gorgeous yet fantastic beauty! O sylph amid the shrubberies of Arnhem! O naiad among its fountains! And then all is mystery and terror, and a tale which should not be told. Disease, a fatal disease, fell like the simian upon her frame, and even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of change swept over her, pervading her mind, her habits, her character, and in a manner the most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of a person. Alas, the destroyer came and went, and the victim, where is she? I knew her not, or I knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the numerous trains of maladies, superinduced by that fatal and primary one which effected a revolution of so horrible a kind in the moral and physical being of my cousin, may be mentioned as the most distressing and obstinate in its nature, a species of epilepsy, not unfrequently terminating in trance itself, trance very nearly resembling positive dissolution, and from which her manner of recovery was in most instances a startling abrupt. In the meantime, my own disease, for I have been told that I should call it by no other appellation than disease, my own disease then grew rapidly upon me, and assumed a final monomaniac character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly, momently gaining vigor, and at length obtaining over me the most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I must so term it, monomania, consisted in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in metaphysical science termed the attentive. It is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear, indeed, that it is no manner possible to convey to the mind of the mere general listener an adequate idea of that nervous intensity of interest with which, in my case, the powers of meditation, not to speak technically, busied and buried themselves in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects of the universe, to muse for long, unwearied hours with my attention riveted to some frivolous device on the margin or in the typography of a book, as to become absorbed for the better part of a summer's day in a quaint shadow falling aslant upon the tapestry upon the floor, to lose myself for an entire night in watching the steady flame of a lamp or the embers of a fire, to dream away, to dream away whole days of the perfume of a flower, to repeat monotonously some common word until the sound, by dint of frequent repetition, ceased to convey any idea whatever to the mind, to lose all sense of motion or physical existence by means of absolute bodily quiescence long and obstinately persevered in. Such were a few of the most common and least pernicious vagaries induced by a condition of the mental faculties, not indeed altogether unparalleled, but certainly bidding defiance to anything like analysis or explanation. Yet let me not be misapprehended. The undue earnest of morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in character with that ruminating propensity common to all mankind, and more especially indulged in by persons of ardent imagination. It was not even, as might be at first supposed, an extreme condition or exaggeration of such propensity, but primarily and essentially distinct and different. In one instance, the dreamer or enthusiast, being interested by an object usually not frivolous, imperceptibly loses sight of this object in a wilderness of deductions and suggestions issuing therefrom, and until at the conclusion of a daydream, often replete with luxury, he finds the incitamentum, or the first cause of his musings, entirely vanished and forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably, I say, frivolous, although assuming, through the medium of my distempered vision, a refracted and unreal importance. Few deductions, if any, were made, and those few pertinaciously returning in upon the original object as assented. The meditations were never pleasurable, and at the termination of the reverie, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained that supernaturally exaggerated interest which was the prevailing feature of the disease. In a word, the powers of mind more particularly exercised were with me, as I have said before, the attentive, and I with the daydreamer, the speculative. My books. Yes, my books at this epoch, if they did not actually serve to irritate the disorder partook, it will be perceived largely in their imagination, inconsequential nature of the characteristic qualities of the disorder itself. I well remember among my books the treatise of the noble Italian Scalia Sodonus Curio, De Amplitudine Beate Regni Dei, St. Austin's great work, The City of God, and Tudlian's De Cane Christe, in which the paradoxical sentence, Multius est Dei filius, credible est quia ineptum est Dei, et sepultus resurrexit setem est Dei quia impossible est, occupied my undivided time for many weeks of laborious and fruitless investigation. Thus it will appear that, shaken from its balance only by trivial things, my reason bore semblance to the ocean crag spoken of by Ptolemy Hephaestion, which, steadily resisting the attacks of human violence and the fiercer fury of the waters and the winds, trembled only to touch the flower called asphodel, and although to a careless thinker it might appear a matter beyond doubt, the alteration produced by her unhappy malady in the moral condition of Berenice would afford me many objects for the exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation whose nature I have been at some trouble in explaining, yet such was not in any degree the case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmity, Berenice's calamity indeed gave me pain, and taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fail to ponder frequently and bitterly upon the wonder-working means by which so strange a revolution had been so suddenly brought to pass. But these reflections partook not of the idiosyncrasy of my disease, and was such as would have occurred under similar circumstances to the ordinary mass of mankind. True to its own character, my disorder revelled in the less important but more startling changes wrought in the physical frame of Berenice. Welcome. Hi, Nettles. My disorder reveled more in the singular, most appalling distortion of her personal identity. During the brightest days of Berenice's unparalleled beauty, most surely I had never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passion always were of the mind. And through the grey of the early morning, among the trellis shadows of the forest at noonday, in the silence of my library at night, Berenice had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her not as the living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream, not as a being of this earthy, but as the abstraction of such a being, not as a thing to admire, but a thing to analyze. Hello, Kara. Not as an object of love, but as the theme of the most abstruse, although desultory speculation. And now I shuddered in her presence, and grew pale at her approach. Yet bitterly lamenting her fallen and desolate condition, I called to mind that she had loved me long, and in an evil moment I spoke to her of marriage. And at length the period of our nuptials were approaching, when upon an afternoon in the winter of the year, one of those unseasonably warm, calm, and misty days which are the nurse of the beautiful halcyon, I sat, as I thought, alone, in the inner apartment of the library. But uplifting my eyes, I saw that Berenice stood before me. Now was it my own excited imagination, the misty influence of the atmosphere, the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the grey draperies which fell around her figure that caused in it so vacillating and indistinct an outline? I could not tell. She spoke no words, and I, not for worlds, could have I uttered a syllable. An icy chill ran through my frame, a sense of insufferable anxiety oppressed me, a consuming curiosity pervaded my soul, and sinking back upon the chair, I remained for some time breathless, motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. Alas, its emaciation was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked in any single line of the contour. My burning glances at length fell upon the face. The forehead was high and very pale, singularly placid. The once jetty hair fell partially over it, and overshadowed the hollow temples with innumerable ringlets, and now of a vivid yellow and a jarring discordantly in their fantastic character, with the reigning melancholy of the countenance. The eyes were lifeless and lusterless and seemingly pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from the glassy stare to the contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of peculiar meaning the teeth of the changed Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God that I had never beheld those teeth, or that having done so I had died. The shutting of a door disturbed me, and on looking up I found that my cousin had departed from the chamber. But from the disordered chamber of my brain she had not at last departed, and would not be driven away the white and ghastly spectrum of those teeth. Not a speck on their surface, not a shade on their enamel, not an indenture in their edges, and what that period of her smile had sufficed to brand in upon my memory, I saw them now even more unequivocally than I beheld them then. The teeth. They were here. They were there, and they were everywhere, and visibly and palpably before me, long and narrow and excessively white, with pale lips writhing about them, and in the very moment of their first terrible development, and then came the full fury of my monomania, and I struggled in vain against its strange and irresistible influence. In the multiplied objects of the external world I had no thoughts but for the teeth. These I longed with a frenzied desire. All other matters and all different interests became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present to the mental eye, and they, in their sole individuality, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light, I turned them in every attitude, I surveyed their characteristics, I dwelt upon their peculiarities, I pondered upon their conformation, I mused upon the alteration in their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them in imagination a sensitive and sentient power, and even when unassisted by their lips, a capability of moral expression. Of Mademoiselle Salle, it has been well said, que tu sais pas etienne sentimentes. And of Berenice, I more seriously believed que tu te sais dentes décides. And here was the idiotic thought that destroyed me, décides, and therefore it was that I coveted them so madly. I felt that their possession could alone ever restore me to peace and giving me back to reason. And the evening closed in upon me thus, and then the darkness came and tarried and went, and the day again dawned, and the mists of a second night were now gathering around, and still I sat motionless in that solitary room. Still I sat buried in meditation, and still the phantasm of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy, as with the most vivid, hideous distinctness it floated about them amid the changing lights and shadows of that chamber. At length there broke in upon my dreams a cry as of horror and dismay, and thereunto after a pause succeeded the sound of troubled voices, intermingled with many low moanings of sorrow or of pain. I arose from my seat. Throwing open one of the doors of the library, I saw standing out in the antechamber a servant maiden, all in tears, who told me that Berenice was no more. She had been seized with epilepsy in the early morning, and now at the closing of the night the grave was ready for its tenant, and all the preparations for the burial were completed. I found myself sitting in the library, and again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened now from a confused and exciting dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred. But of that dreary period which intervened, I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. Yet its memory to me was replete with horror more horrible from being vague, and terror the more terrible from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. I strive to decipher them, but in vain, while ever and anon, like the spirit of a departed sound, the shrilling and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. I had done a deed. But what was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp, and near it lay a little box. It was of no remarkable character. I had seen it frequently before, for it was the property of the family physician. But how it came there, upon my table, and why did I shudder in regarding it? These things were in no manner to be accounted for. And my eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book, and to a sentence underscored therein. The words were the singular but simple ones of the poet Ibn Zayat. Desibiant mehe sodale se sepulchrum, amice visitalium, curas mes aquiliatum. My companions told me I might find some little alleviation of my misery in visiting the grave of my beloved. Yes. Why then, as I perused them, did the hairs of my head erect themselves on end, and the blood of my body become congealed within my veins. And then there came a light tap at the library door, and pale as the tenant of a tomb, a menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulous and husky and very low. What said he? Some broken sentences I heard. He told of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound. And then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered me of a violated grave, a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. And then he pointed to my garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke out. He took me gently by the hand. It was indented with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded to the table. I grasped the box that lay upon it, but before I could force it open, and in my tremor it slipped from my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces. And from it, with a rattling sound, there rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, and intermingled with 32 small, white, ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor. Ugh. Well, Berenice, the story has a bit of a bite to it, eh, what? Made me think of the Bumble, you know, the abdominal snowman, snow monster from Rudolph. Well, perhaps we should cleanse the palate a bit with a poem celebrating the beauty and nurturing power of woman. Yes, Bumbles bounce. Here Poe is referring to the beauty of Helen of Troy, while in truth speaking about his first real love interest, Jane Stannard, his childhood friend's mother, and describes her many exquisite features. To Helen was one of the first poems Poe ever wrote, but was also one of two poems by Poe titled To Helen. But this is the first one. To Helen. I saw thee once only, years ago. I must not say how many, but not many. It was a July midnight, and from out a full-orbed moon that, like thine own soul soaring, sought a precipitant pathway up through heaven. There fell a silvery silken veil of light, with quietude and sultriness and slumber, upon the upturned faces of 1,000 roses that grew in an enchanted garden, where no wind dared to stir less on tiptoe. Fell on the upturned faces of these roses that gave out in return for their love light their odorous souls in an ecstatic death. Fell on the upturned faces of these roses that smiled and died in this parterre, enchanted by thee and by the poetry of thy presence. Clad all in white upon a violet bank I saw, thee half reclining, while the moon fell on the upturned faces of the roses, and on thine own upturned, alas, in sorrow. Was it not fate that on this July midnight, was it not fate, whose name is also sorrow, that bade me pause before that garden gate to breathe the incense of those slumbering roses? No footstep stirred. The hated world all slept, save only thee and me. I paused, I looked, and in an instant all things disappeared. Bear in mind, this garden was enchanted. The pearly luster of the moon went out, the mossy banks, the meandering paths, the happy flowers, the repining trees were seen no more. The very roses' odors died in the arms of the adoring airs. All expired save thee, save less than thou. Save only the divine light in thine eyes, save but the soul in thine uplifted eyes. I saw but them, they were the world to me. I saw but them, they saw only them for hours. Saw only them until the moon went down. What wild heart history seemed lie enwritten upon those crystalline celestial spheres. How dark a woe, yet how sublime a hope. How silently serene a sea of pride, how daring an ambition, yet how deep. How fathomless a capacity for love. And now at length dark Diane sank from sight, into a western couch of thundercloud, and thou, a ghost, amid the entombing trees didst glide away. Only thine eyes remained. They would not go. They never yet have gone, lighting my own lonely pathway home that night. They have not left me as my hopes have since. They follow me. They lead me through the years. They are my ministers, yet I their slave. Their office is to illumine and enkindle. My duty to be saved with their bright light, and purified in their electric fire, and sanctified in their Elysian fire. They fill my soul with beauty, which is hope. They are far up in heaven, the stars I kneel to in the sad, silent watchers of my night. While even in the meridian glare of day I see them still, two sweetly scintillant Venuses, unextinguished by the sun. Well, that's a better obsession with pretty eyes than pretty teeth, I guess. That was to Helen. Okay, the next one I just recently found by looking at a suggestion from Misk. This is called The Scythe of Time. It's a humorous short story by Edgar Allan Poe. How often do you hear that? Usually combined with its companion piece, How to Write a Blackwood article, which our friend Miss Thorne suggested. It was later entitled A Predicament. These paired stories parody the Gothic sensation tale popular in England and America since the early 19th century. The eyes have it. What chance, good lady, hath bereft you thus? It was a quiet and still afternoon when I strolled forth in the goodly city of Edina. The confusion and bustle in the streets were terrible. Men were talking, women were screaming, children were choking, pigs were whistling, carts they rattled, bulls they bellowed, cows they lowed, horses they neighed, cats they caterwauled, dogs they danced. Danced! Could it then be possible? Danced! Alas, thought I, my dancing days are over. Thus it is ever. What a host of gloomy recollections will ever and anon be awakened in the mind of genius and imaginative contemplation, especially of a genius doomed to the everlasting and eternal and continual, as one might say, the continued and continuous, bitter, harassing, disturbing, and, if I may be allowed the expression, the very disturbing influence of the serene and godlike and heavenly and exalted and elevated and purifying effect of what they might rightly be termed the most enviable and most truly enviable, nay, the most benignly beautiful, the most deliciously ethereal, and as it were the most pretty, if I may use so bold an expression, thing, pardon me, gentle listener, in the world. But I am always led away by my feelings. In such a mind, I repeat, what a host of recollections are stirred up by a trifle. The dogs danced. I could not. They frisked. I wept. They capered. I sobbed aloud. Touching circumstance, which cannot fail to bring to the recollection of the classical listener that exquisite passage in relation to the fitness of things which is to be found in the commencement of the 3rd volume of that admirable and venerable Chinese novel, The Zhou Go Slow. In my solitary walk through the city, I had 2 humble but faithful companions.
Diana, my poodle, sweetest of creatures. She had a quantity of hair over one eye and a blue ribbon tied fashionably round her neck. Diana was not more than 5 inches in height, but her head was somewhat bigger than her body, and her tail, being cut off exceedingly close, gave an air of injured innocence to the interesting animal which rendered her a favourite with all. And Pompey, my retainer, sweet Pompey, how shall I forget thee? I had taken Pompey's arm. He was 3 feet in height, I like to be particular, and about 70 or perhaps 80 years of age. He had bow legs and was corpulent. His mouth should not be called small, nor his ears short. His teeth, however, were like pearls, and his large full eyes were deliciously white. Nature had endowed him with no neck, and had placed his ankles in the middle of the upper portion of the feet. He was clad with a striking simplicity. His sole garments were a stock of 9 inches in height, and a nearly new drab overcoat, which had formerly been in the service of the tall, stately, and illustrious Dr. Moneypenny. Now, it was a good overcoat. It was well cut. It was well made. The coat was nearly new. Pompey held it up out of the dirt with both hands. There were 3 persons in our party, and 2 of them have already been the subject of remark. There was a third. That person was myself. I am Signora Psyche Zenobia. I am not Suki Snobs. My appearance is commanding. One of the memorable occasions of which I speak, I was habited in a crimson satin dress with a sky-blue Arabian mantlet, and the dress had trimmings of green agrafas and 7 graceful flounces of the orange-coloured auricula. I formed the third of this party. There was the poodle, there was Pompey, there was myself. We were 3. Thus it is said there were originally but 3 Furies, Melty, Nimi, and Hetty, meditation, memory, and fiddling. Leaning upon the arm of the gallant Pompey, and attended at a respectable distance by Diana, I proceeded down one of the populous and very pleasant streets of the now deserted Edina. On a sudden there presented itself to view a church, a Gothic cathedral, vast, venerable, and with a tall steeple which towered into the sky. What madness now possessed me? Why did I rush upon my fate? I was seized with an uncontrollable desire to ascend the giddy pinnacle and then survey the immense extent of the city. The door of the cathedral stood invitingly open. My destiny prevailed. I entered the ominous archway. Where then was my guardian angel? If indeed such angels there be, if, distressing monosyllable, if, what world of mystery and meaning and doubt and uncertainty is there involved in thy 2 letters? If. I entered the ominous archway. I entered, and without injury to my orange-coloured auriculas, I passed beneath the portal and emerged within the vestibule. And thus it is said the immense river Alfred passed unscathed and unwetted beneath the sea. I thought the staircase would never have an end. Round, yes, they went round and up, and round and up, and round and up, and round and up, and round and up, until I could not help surmising with sagacious Pompey, upon whose supporting arm I leaned in all the confidence of early affection, I could not help surmising that the upper end of the continuous spiral ladder had been accidentally, or perhaps designedly, removed. I paused for breath, and in the meantime an accident occurred of too momentous a nature in a moral and also in a metaphysical point of view to be passed over without notice. It appeared to me, indeed I was quite confident of the fact, that I could not be mistaken. No, I had for some moments carefully and anxiously observed the motions of my Diana. I say that I could not be mistaken. Diana smelt a rat. At once I called Pompey's attention to the subject, and he agreed with me. There was then no longer any reasonable room for doubt. The rat had been smelled, and by Diana. Heavens, shall I ever forget the intense excitement of that moment? Alas, what is the boasted intellect of man? The rat. It was there. That is to say, it was somewhere. Diana smelled the rat. I could not. Thus it is said the Prussian Isis has, for some reasons, in some persons, a sweet and very powerful perfume, while to others it is perfectly scentless. The staircase had been surmounted, and there was now only 3 or 4 more upward steps intervening between us and the summit. We still ascended, and now only 1 step remained. 1 step, 1 little step. Upon 1 such little step in the great staircase of human life, how vast a sum of human happiness or misery depends. 1 little step. I thought of myself, then of Pompey, and then of the mysterious and inexplicable destiny which surrounded us. I thought of Pompey. Alas, I thought of love. I thought of many false steps which have been taken and may be taken again. I resolved to be more cautious, more reserved. I abandoned the arm of Pompey, and without his assistance I surmounted the one remaining step, and I gained the chamber of the belfry. I was followed immediately afterward by my poodle. Pompey alone remained behind. I stood at the head of the staircase. I encouraged him to ascend. He stretched forth to me his hand, and unfortunately in so doing was forced to abandon his firm hold upon the overcoat. Will the gods never cease their persecution? The overcoat is dropped, and with one of his feet Pompey stepped upon the long and trailing skirt of the overcoat. He stumbled and fell. This consequence was inevitable. He fell forward, and with his accursed head striking me full in the breast, precipitated me headlong, together with myself, upon the hard, filthy, detestable floor of the belfry. But my revenge was sure, sudden, and complete. Seizing him furiously by the hair with both hands, I tore out a vast quantity of the black, crisp, and curly material, and I tossed it from me with every manifestation of disdain. It fell among the ropes of the belfry and remained. Pompey arose and said no word, but he regarded me piteously with his large eyes and sighed. Oh, ye gods, that sigh! It sunk into my heart, and the hair I had torn out. Hello, Modi. Could I have reached that hair, I would have bathed it with my tears in testimony of regret. But alas, it was now far beyond my grasp, and as it dangled among the cordage of the bell, I fancied it alive. I fancied that it stood on end with indignation, and thus the happy dandy Flosseries of Java bears, it is said, a beautiful flower which will live when pulled up by the roots. The natives suspend it by a cord from the ceiling and enjoy its fragrance for years. Our quarrel was now made up. We looked about the room for an aperture through which to survey the city of Edina. Windows there were none. The sole light emitted into the gloomy chamber proceeded from a square opening about a foot in diameter, at a height of about 7 feet from the floor. And yet, what will the energy of true genius not effect? I resolved to clamber up to this hole. A vast quantity of wheels and pinions and other cabalistic-looking machinery stood opposite the hole, close to it. Through the hole there passed an iron rod from the machinery. Between the wheels and the wall where the hole lay, there was barely room for my body, yet I was desperate and determined to persevere. I called Pompey to my side. You perceive the aperture, Pompey. I wish to look through it. You will stand here just beneath the hole. So. Now hold out one of your hands, Pompey, and let me step upon it. Thus. Now the other hand, Pompey, and with its aid I will get upon your shoulders. Now he did everything I wished, and I found, upon getting up, that I could easily pass my head and neck through the aperture. The prospect was sublime. Nothing could be more magnificent. I merely paused a moment to bid Diana behave herself, and assure Pompey I would be considerate and bear as lightly as possible upon his shoulders. I told him I'd be tender of his feelings. Ose tender que beefsteak. Having done this justice to my faithful friend, I gave myself up with great zest and enthusiasm to the enjoyment of the scene which so obligingly spread itself before my eyes. Now, upon this subject, however, I shall forbear to dilate. I will not describe the city of Edinburgh. Everyone's been to Edinburgh, the classic Edina. I will confine myself to the momentous details of my own lamentable adventure. Having in some measure satisfied my curiosity in regard to the extent, situation, and general appearance of the city, I had leisure to survey the church in which I was and the delicate architecture of the steeple. I observed that the aperture through which I had thrust my head was an opening into the dial plate of a gigantic clock, and must have appeared from the street as a large keyhole, such as we see in the face of the French watches. Now, no doubt the true object was to admit the arm of an attendant to adjust, when necessary, the hands of the clock from within. I observed also, with surprise, the immense size of these hands, the longest of which could have not been less than 10 feet in length, and broadest 8 or 9 inches in breadth. These hands were of solid steel, apparently, and their edges appeared to be sharp. Having noticed these particulars, and some others, I again turned my eyes upon the glorious prospect below me, and soon became absorbed in contemplation. From this, after some minutes, I was aroused by the voice of Pompey, who declared that he could stand it no longer, and requested that I would be so kind as to come down. This was unreasonable, and I told him so in a speech of some length. He replied with an evident misunderstanding of my ideas upon the subject. I accordingly grew angry, and I told him in plain words that he was a fool, that he committed an ignoramus e clenchi, and that his notions were mere insomere bovis, and his words little better than any enemy vere borum. With this he appeared satisfied, and I resumed my contemplation. Now, it might have been half an hour after this altercation, when, as I was deeply absorbed in the heavenly scenery beneath me, I was startled by something very cold which pressed with gentle pressure on the back of my neck. Now, it is needless to say that I felt inexpressibly alarmed. I knew that Pompey was beneath my feet, and that Diana was sitting according to my explicit directions upon her hind legs in the farthest corner of the room. What could it be? Alas, I but too soon discovered. Turning my head gently to one side, I perceived to my extreme horror that the huge, glittering, scimitar-like minute hand of the clock had, in the course of its hourly revolution, descended upon my neck. There was, I knew not a second to be lost. I pulled back at once, but it was already too late. There was no chance of forcing my head through the mouth of that terrible trap in which it was so fairly caught, which grew narrower and narrower with a rapidity too horrible to be conceived. The agony of that moment is not to be imagined. I threw up my hands and endeavored with all my strength to force upward the ponderous iron bar. I might as well try to lift the cathedral itself. Down, down, down it came, closer and yet closer. I screamed to Pompey for aid, but he said that I had hurt his feelings by calling him an ignorant old... I yelled to Diana, but she only said, "Bow, wow, wow," and that I had told her on no account to stir from the corner. Thus I had no relief to expect from my associates. Meantime, the ponderous and terrific scythe of time, for I now discovered the literal import of that classical phrase, had not stopped, nor was it likely to stop in its career. And down, still down it came. It had already buried its sharp edge a full inch into my flesh, and my sensation grew indistinct and confused. At one time I fancied myself in Philadelphia with the stately Dr. Moneypenny, and another in the back parlor of Mr. Blackwood, receiving his invaluable instructions. And then again the sweet recollection of better and earlier time came over me, and I thought that happy period when the world was not all a desert and Pompey not altogether cruel. The ticking of the machinery amused me. Amused me, I say, for my sensations now bordered upon perfect happiness, and the most trifling circumstances afforded me pleasure. The eternal click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, click, slack, click of the clock was the most melodious of music in my ears, and occasionally even put me in mind of the grateful sermonic harangues of Dr. Olapod. And then there were the great figures upon the dial plate. How intelligent, how intellectual they all looked. And presently they took to dancing the mazurka, and I think it was the figure V who performed the most to my satisfaction. She was evidently a lady of breeding, none of your swaggerers, and nothing at all indelicate in her motions. She did the pirouette to admiration, whirling around upon her apex. I made endeavor to hand her a chair, for I saw that she appeared fatigued with her exertions. It was not until then that I fully perceived my lamentable situation. Lamentable indeed. The bar had buried itself 2 inches into my neck. I was aroused to a sense of exquisite pain. I prayed for death, and in the agony of the moment could not help repeating those exquisite verses of the poet Miguel de Cervantes: "Vani burrentani escondida, carry no terri senti veni, pork and pleasure deli mori, nami torni deri vidi." But now a new horror presented itself, and one indeed sufficient to startle the strongest nerves. My eyes, from the cruel pressure of the machine, were absolutely starting from their sockets, and while I was thinking how I should possibly manage without them, one actually tumbled out of my head and rolled down the steep side of the steeple, lodged in the rain gutter from which ran along the eaves of the main building. Now the loss of the eye was not so much as the insolent air of independence and contempt with which it regarded me after it was out. There it lay in the gutter just under my nose, and the airs it gave itself would have been ridiculous had they not been disgusting. Such a winking and blinking were never before seen. This behavior on the part of my eye in the gutter was not only irritating on account of its manifest insolence and shameful ingratitude, but was also exceedingly inconvenient on account of the sympathy which always exists between 2 eyes of the same head, however far apart. I was forced, in a manner, to wink and to blink, and whether I would or not, in exact concert with the scoundrelly thing that lay just under my nose. I was presently relieved, however, by the dropping out of the other eye. In falling, it took the same direction, possibly a concerted plot as its fellow. Both rolled out of the gutter together, and in truth I was very glad to be rid of them. The bar was now 4 inches and a half deep in my neck. There was only a little bit of skin to cut through. My sensations were those of entire happiness, for I felt that in a few minutes at farthest I should be relieved of my disagreeable situation, and in this expectation I was not at all deceived. At 25 minutes past 5 in the afternoon precisely, the huge minute hand had proceeded sufficiently far on its terrible revolution to sever the small remainder of my neck. Now, I was not sorry to see the head, which had occasioned me so much embarrassment, at length make a final separation from my body. It rolled down the side of the temple, then lodged for a few seconds in the gutter, and then made its way with a plunge into the middle of the street. I will candidly confess that my feelings were now of the most singular, nay, of the most mysterious, the most perplexing and incomprehensible character. My senses were here and there at one and the same moment. With my head, I imagined at one time that I, the head, was the real Signora Psyche Zenobia. And another, I felt convinced that myself, the body, was the proper identity. And to clear my ideas on this topic, I felt in my pocket for my snuff-box, but upon getting it out and endeavoring to apply a pinch of its grateful contents in the ordinary manner, I became immediately aware of my peculiar deficiency. And so I threw the box at once down to my head. It took a pinch with great satisfaction and smiled me in acknowledgment in return. Shortly afterwards, it made me a speech which I could hear but indistinctly without ears. I gathered enough, however, to know that it was astonished at my wishing to remain alive under such circumstances. In the concluding sentences, it quoted the noble words of Erasto, "Il pover hami che nana sera cordi, and have a combat tenti eri morti," thus comparing me to the hero who, in the heat of combat, not perceiving that he was dead, continued to contest the battle with inextinguishable valor. There was nothing now to prevent my getting down from my elevation, and I did so. What was it that Pompey saw so very peculiar in my appearance? I have never yet been able to find out. The fellow opened his mouth from ear to ear, shut its 2 eyes as if they were endeavoring to crack nuts between the lids. Finally, throwing off his overcoat, he made one spring for the staircase and disappeared. I hurled after the scoundrel those vehement words of Demosthenes, "Andrew O'Faligan, you really make haste to fly." And then I turned to the darling of my heart, to the one-eyed, the shaggy-haired Diana. Alas, what a horrible vision affronted my eyes! Was that a rat I saw skulking into his hole? Are these the picked bones of my little angel who had been cruelly devoured by that monster? Ye gods, what do I behold? Is that a departed spirit? The shade, the ghost of my beloved puppy, which I perceive sitting with a grace so melancholy in the corner. Hearken, for she speaks, and heaven it is in the German of Schiller. Uns stubby duk so stubby dun duxi. Alas, and are not her words too true? And if I died, at least I died for thee. Sweet creature, she too has sacrificed herself on my behalf. Dogless, retainerless, headless, what now remains for the unhappy Signora Psyche Zenobia? Alas, nothing. I have done.
So that's our dear friend,
Signora Psyche Zenobia.
which brings us to the end of the hour. So